So I'll get that started. Like you said, my name is Ryan Goldman. I come from a company called Pendo. Pendo is an interesting case. Again, it is from North Carolina. We have an office here in San Francisco, offices in London, in Sheffield, England, in Tel Aviv, in New York. I already managed to slip Sheffield, England in there, and no one made a face, so I could just like make up Des Moines, Iowa. Like Sheffield, England is sort of like an unusual place for a technology hub, but we managed to pull it off. So I will be talking about product operations. It's a relatively new term, although we do have data that says that has taken off, that's actually getting quite a bit of uptake in the market. And over the course of this talk, I will also cast some shade on some of the other buzz terms that we hear about in terms of like what's cool and what you need to do in order to like get your startup to be, cost effective and grow really, really fast. Oh, that's not easy to read. Okay, so the topics I'll cover are, introduction and enthusiastic welcome. Give me that enthusiastic welcome. All right, yes. To you all also, I'm happy to be here. I'll also talk about the big pivot, this idea of expanding on product-led. Product-led is going to be the term that I kind of take advantage of a little bit. And then kind of giving a framework for how to scale towards ROI. This idea of product operations being specifically about how the product organization starts to think about its return on investment, not only in terms of its time, but also in terms of money, budget, people, experiments, all the things that we care about. So that's me, I'm he. My name is Ryan. I'm originally from Philadelphia. I've been in the Bay Area for a little over a decade. My course to get here has been sort of unusual. So this is kind of the fun one right here, where I started. It's not a software company, it's nonprofit. So I spent the first 8 years of my career in Washington, D.C., doing policy work and advocacy and international development for these weird nonprofit organizations, some of which are really cool and do great work, some of which no longer exist because of things like laundering money. And I didn't do any of those things, but it does happen. I can attest. When you're working in developing countries, sometimes you have to grease the wheels. After going to business school, I spent some time at a really, really tiny startup called Cisco. And then after that, the real gray hairs started to pop up, and I went into the world of startups. Believe it or not, when I joined Cloudera, it was a startup. In the past couple of years, it's kind of glommed on to other things and absorbed some of its competition, but it was a very, very early stage company. You'll also notice there's a little bit of open source in there, which is one of the things that I really care about, as well as developer tools, PM tools. I've not yet worked at a startup that targets people like me, like marketers. I have not sold to a marketer. I don't even know what it's like. I prefer to sell to people who are looking at the product from a different kind of perspective, that are looking at the market from the perspective of the person building, or even operationalizing, as the case may be. So why do we care about this kind of stuff when we talk about the changes towards things like product-led? Well, it generates revenue differently. It has a lower cost. This idea that like you're growing faster and at lower cost, these efficiencies are pretty compelling. And so thinking about like, do I make changes or do I start to build my business around this idea that like the product does the work can be really compelling and really important. So we have this data from our friends at OpenView Partners who have their own conference on product-led. And their definition is mostly freemium. Product-led in most people's minds, because we need something that's simple to kind of like put our arms around, is freemium. You start with something that is free, and then the people who like it will bring it into their organizations, and they will spread it to their friends and colleagues, and it'll just show up, and eventually someone with budget and some level of responsibility and management over things like security and access will decide to pay for it. And then you'll become like Datadog or Box or one of these great companies, and we'll go public, and you'll be worth billions and billions of dollars. And the data stands for it, right? We see this index for revenue and for efficiency. Product-led beats traditional SaaS, and traditional SaaS beats pretty much every other industry. So go do it, right? Well, not always, right? we start to look at some of the other data and we say, oh, wait, we're able to spend much more money on R&D because we're not spending it on things like the business, like sales, like marketing, like business development. And that's a good thing. But it's a double-edged sword. If you're spending much more of your money on product and on development, there's also a bigger responsibility on that part of the organization to drive revenue. You have to be efficient. You have to think through, is this aligned to return on investment? Because without those kinds of controls, you end up in a situation, potentially, where you're making bets after bets after bets because you wanna, because you have nothing to actually hold you accountable besides that first bet was really great. Those second, third, fourth, fifth bets may be good, may be bad, but if you're not using some kind of operational view of the relationship between product decisions and revenue and efficiency, then you don't know if your second and third version of product-led is even working. So we think of product-led as kind of a continuation of some of the other things that have come before it. Agility. You know, agility is great, but it tells you how to develop more effectively. You're moving faster, and sure, you're breaking things, but you're moving faster. Then after that, we said, well, we don't want to break things so much, especially the relationship in terms of like how one part of the product organization works with another part of the product organization. So let's build better collaboration and better communication between the developers and the operations folks. There you have DevOps. Still a bit of a cost center because it's not really tied to revenue, it's just tied towards development efficiency. Well, what comes after that? Probably cost if you're not thinking about it. And we have data that shows it. It's getting much, much harder and much more expensive to actually gain traction. These good ideas are good at first, but the secondary, the third idea, the fourth idea, it's hard to actually get uptake. Also, Pendo has its own data that shows that $30 billion in the SaaS industry is wasted because features, even parts of products, are developed that no one uses. When I say no one, I really mean no one. Fewer than 5% of the total market. And the total market isn't all the people out there, it's all the people who are using your product. Really, 5% of the features, 80% of the features in products that have already been adopted are being used by fewer than 5% of those people. That's a big, big waste. It's great that there's more money being put towards development and product. Fantastic, that is the right thing to do. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to actually grow and doing the right things in terms of like ideation, development, articulation, and then eventually trying to iterate, well, is it iteration or should you be thinking about like maybe I shouldn't have done this in the first place? You have to have some relationship between those good ideas, the development of those good ideas, and whether or not they drive the business. So that's where product operations comes in. It's strategy. For the first time, the product strategy isn't just the idea behind it, it's whether or not it actually relates to the business outcome for which you built it in the first place. And it's kind of a mind-breaking idea because that's not how startups have necessarily worked in the past. You haven't had part of the product organization taking any responsibility for traditional business metrics. You've said, oh, it's great, you know, let's make better relationships, like the last speaker, better relationships between the product organization and the marketing organization or the sales organization. But there's never necessarily been this ownership level. And that's where I think product-led needs to start bleeding into product operations. You actually have to operationalize these new metrics so that they're part of the product organization's purview. So there's a shift here, right? It's not only a shift in thinking, but it's a shift in behavior. The first, and we talk about this a lot at Pendo, is going from projects to products. It's not enough for the product organization to simply think about what am I managing right now? What is this person's role in terms of managing this project's timeline, delivery, that kind of stuff. You actually have to think through in terms of the product because that's the surface of the relationship with the user. So sure, you're in the product organization, but you're probably not necessarily thinking about the experience, the user, the kind of whole collection of all the things that you're touching and not touching. That's a pretty important switch. So when I say this, I'm talking about the entire thing, kit and caboodle, end to end. So not just the part or the feature that you're working on, but how it fits within the larger experience. So we think about this as like the only meaningful surface. This is the definition of product-led. Like, this is enough, right? In most cases, this is where you start. You basically say, the way you acquire, the way you grow is through the product. It's a flywheel, so you have to invest in it properly. It can do a lot of the things that we have historically thought of as the responsibility of like marketers like me. You can put in offers. You can try and provoke people to behave differently, to expand their usage. That can all happen in the product more and more. But if you're not thinking about iteration, if you're not thinking about how to take those insights and put them back into your strategy, then you're probably missing out. Just saying you have a surface for communicating is not enough. You actually have to say, am I communicating the right thing for the right reasons to the right people? Or should I go back into the product and make changes? Should I change my product strategy based on data? Do I have the right kind of intelligence to actually become strategic and take a seat at the table? So the other part of it is outcomes. This gets to this idea of product intelligence. So you should be looking at data consistently. Some of the data is a thing that, like, over the past few years we've said, okay, product manager tools, analytics. Like, let's see if when I launch something, is it being adopted? Are they staying around? Is the retention there? What are my MAUs and my DAUs? Those are all important data points. But shouldn't you also be thinking about the correlation between those things and revenue? Acquisition cost? Growth? Could you possibly be thinking about how to use insights about what people have done behaviorally as it relates to what they'll do next? And I'm not talking about machine learning. Machine learning is great, but it's not part of the kit of tools that the product management organization has access to. But there are ways to understand if you've done a certain thing in the past and we want you to do something particular in the future, how do we get them to do it? How do we get that intimacy and start to think about the outcome of the relationship? Can I build towards some kind of behavior change or outcome as opposed to only building against what you've done historically? So, shaping the business. I mean, there's not that huge a rift here between like building features and shaping the business. Like one leads into the other, but it's a matter of whose responsibility it is, who's been thinking about it, who takes accountability for when things go well or go poorly. And I'm saying the product organization can do that. Sure, we have to give them more leverage in order to get there, but it's essential. Product-led into product operations requires some view of business metrics, of driving growth. So these are unusual things for a product organization to care about. These are usually the things that the business operations team cares about, sometimes the CMO, the CRO, but these are a CPO concern. We're talking about cost management. So like, can you figure out when to do things that will basically deplete the number of tickets you're getting from your users? Can you think about sunsetting tools or features at the right time? Next up is increasing customer retention and loyalty. Can you use the product or your product strategy to actually say, hey, for the users I already have, can I contribute to their conversion first, to their retention second, to their renewal and expansion third, and fourth, to their expansion into new lines of business, into new users, into new organizations? You can do that with a product. The third part is driving revenue from digital engagement. So this is sort of getting a little bit enterprisey, but for larger organizations that are building out their digital product and they're making it part of their product mix, if like historically their product wasn't necessarily just an app, it was a shovel or banking or something like that, can you actually monetize? Do you have the insight to figure out for whom you're building something important and how to actually make more money from it? Because it is more efficient to have an app than it is to have a manufacturing plant. And the last one is innovate faster with higher ROI. So a lot of product operations talks about the relationship between the product management team and the rest of the business. This is starting to get into the engineering team. So if we're able to actually like codify some of these insights and make the delta between where the good insight into what you should do next and the person who's actually going to build it shorter, then the engineering team can like actually make better bets, can actually take part in innovation in a way that developers haven't necessarily been in the past. So first I'm saying, let's reduce the role of marketing. Then I'm saying, over time, let's actually reduce the role of product management, not because that product managers can't be important, but because they have too much to do. We make this shift where we say, like, first, give them too much to do, then actually narrow it down so that they can be more focused. Pass the buck because there's always someone else who can take part in making those decisions. And it actually grows everyone closer together. So it's this idea that, like, sure, DevOps is a start, but both the product organization, the operations organization, the development organization, they can all grow closer, much more closely together. All right, and it's a maturity curve. Like, it's not gonna happen overnight. You have to basically break it into, like, where is your vision? Where are you today? How do you start to kind of pick which capabilities you want to build in first? Because you're not gonna eat the elephant in the first bite. So it's just kind of thinking through, how do you get there? How do you build a plan? And there's a framework for this. The first thing is thinking about the entire user experience. This seems obvious. So if you've ever looked at a product analytics tool, these things are relatively obvious. But they're not obvious to everyone. And so really taking into consideration, like, can we measure and associate with business outcomes at each of these stages? Can we actually build cohorts out of the people who are either doing this well or doing this poorly? That's a pretty important step. And you'll notice, historically, when we do talk about product intelligence, we really focus on getting to this outcome. If you can get to a point where you can anticipate growth and drive it, your product's doing a great job. What I'm saying is, go into planning mode. Like, allow your roadmap to be based not only on good ideation and good brainstorming and kind of an understanding of the market at whole, but the users you already have. How can you plan against that and then drive it back to the beginning? So each new idea, each new feature, each new capability takes into consideration the users you want to acquire as well as the users you already have. It's a little bit of a shift if you think about it. So, do we have evidence that product operations is even taking hold? Well, yes and no. Yes, in that LinkedIn has all this data that says, like, people's titles and their capabilities now involve the words product and operations. But does product operations mean the same thing everywhere? Well, certainly not. Like, we haven't gotten to a point where, like, we all agree a product operations person has all of these objectives and all of these tools, and they have all of these things within their tool belt. You know, I'm advocating for a way of looking at it, but we're not quite there in terms of, like, full agreement, and that's okay. But if I had to say, like, here are some of the things that they should care about, if we're going to, like, transition beyond just product-led into product operations, what should they be concerned for and why? So it's this kit, and the goal is scale, right? I've already said it. The idea isn't to eliminate the responsibilities or the ownership or the visibility of the product organization. It's to help them scale, because there will always be more users and more customers than there are product managers. So can we get them to a point where they can most accurately guess the right things based on data, based on insight, based on, like, a bet that has a little bit of wood behind the arrow? So first, tools. There is a stack. Surprise, surprise. Pendo, my company, is in a few of these areas, but there is a stack. The idea is you have to start with analytics. Sure, you have to understand what's happening behaviorally. But there are also areas like prototyping, actually driving and managing onboarding, being able to speak to the user in the surface of the product. Like, we tend to think of these things as separate, and they shouldn't be. Just this morning, my company did a webinar with a great company, LaunchDarkly. And you might say, like, oh, Pendo's a product analytics tool and maybe a little bit of guidance, and then LaunchDarkly does feature flags. Well, yeah, if you put those things together, it's experimentation and rollout. Like, that's important. Like, having a lever to actually say, oh, you didn't do a thing, but we think you should, and maybe you just don't know. Can we speak to you within the application and get you to maybe try this new behavior? These are important steps towards getting buy-in and actually connecting those datas so that there is a better user experience across the board. Data. I mean, I can't say this enough. There are a handful of metrics that every product manager, even if you're in an old-fashioned, more traditional looking at sprints sort of approach, you should still be looking at metrics. You should still have a sense of what is happening with your team's efforts in the market via the user and the product over certain sets of time, and look at those longitudinally, every month, every day, every quarter, whatever. Being able to see what has changed. It affects your view of retention, it affects your view of are we doing the right thing from a product perspective, or if things are fading fast, then maybe it was the marketing team that spent a bunch of money to do the advertising to get people to change their behaviors during a short period of time, but the product didn't have the actual relevance and we didn't have the intimacy with the user to keep it up. So there is a sense of not only looking for things, but removing bias by looking at things over time and continuing to do it with every new idea and every new campaign. Experimentation. So for the product operations organization, it isn't a matter of just doing experiments. It's an idea of tracking experiments, putting some cohesion around when we try new things and why we try them. So this is one of the things that kind of like sets my view of product operations quite a bit apart from other ones, because it's not simply operational in terms of like tracking behaviors. It's saying like when we do an A/B test, when we do a canary test, when we try something different, do we have the right kind of context for making sure that we understand what we're observing? That is part of the role of the product operations organization. And do we have a follow-on strategy? If it's great or if it's bad, do we have a way to say, like, before rolling it back or rolling it forward, can we see if there are investments that we can make that are lightweight to actually change the outcome? And if that change in the outcome is relevant, maybe we don't have to invest any more product dollars or time. Think about it this way. We all know that the user is drunk. No matter how great or terrible your product or your feature is, the user is still drunk. And if your product is great or your feature is great, and they're not doing what they needed to do, and you can't come to terms with like what it is that's blocking them, maybe it's not a product thing at all. Maybe it's just a communication thing. So being able to speak to them in a way that matters to get them past that little piece of conflict may be all the change you need to make. So really thinking through, it's not just the product, it's the way that the product is being experienced. So experimentation, it's UX as well. Strategy, looking forward with certainty. So quantifying qualitative feedback. So I kind of alluded to this earlier. The product organization and product analytics are pretty compelling because compared to all the other data the organization has, it's crystalline, it's perfect, it's based on things that have actually happened. The marketing organization has like its lead flow and its scores, but that's a lot of guessing, or you've inherited that data or bought it and pulled it in. Same thing with the sales organization. A lot of it relies on a salesperson or a sales operations person doing a thing or not doing a thing. With product analytics, if you have the right kind of tracking, then you're going to collect all of that data and it's going to be highly reliable. But it's all things that have happened in the past. A behavior is something that has kind of already, a ship that's already set sail. But we do surveys. Product people do ask questions. If you're able to treat that data in a way that's quantitative by tying it back to those behaviors and those cohorts and those personas and all those other things, you can start to say, like, if I ask what they need next, what their desires are, can I develop a higher level of certainty about what I'm building and for whom, and then tie that back to revenue prospects? Well, probably yes. The product organization has always been in a situation where they say, like, I think I know, but let's build it or build some MVP version of it, roll it out, and see what happens. Operationally, with the right kind of data, they can start to say, I think I know because the users about whom I care most offered me insight into what their prospective behaviors are if something else changed that hasn't even been begun to build. They're just telling us. They're offering us feedback and input in the context of their experience in the product. Whether it's a survey or whether it's just open fields, this is really, really rich information, especially if you can tie it back to the things that they're actually doing, the money that they spend, their other behaviors. It becomes the way to see the future. Also, business metrics. So just at the most basic level, tying those behaviors to outcomes, being cohort-oriented, trying to figure out if cohort A is highly valuable and cohort B is less valuable, what do we need to do to enact some kind of change in cohort B so they act more like cohort A in terms of the money that they drive for our organization? But that's really insightful. It's important. Advisory. So again, being able to actually tie things to the larger objective of the organization and then help the other parts of the organization get there faster and better. Being able to collaborate, going to the marketing organization and saying like, hey, we can actually help you with this. Maybe the way you're doing this today isn't actually close enough to the user's experience. We can move some of the things that you're trying to achieve into the product. Or saying that like, hey, our sales objectives are tough to hit. Are there things that we can tell them to change based on data that we've observed? So taking that strategy, taking that insight, taking that product intelligence, and spreading it more widely. And ultimately, it gets you to scale. The challenge here is, again, not eliminating the role of the product organization by making the data so great so that the developer can make these choices on their own. It's basically saying that the product organization needs to have focus. If they focus on the right things, they can have more impact, they can drive more outcomes, and they can have fewer guessing games and higher certainty about what they're doing and why. It's a tricky balance, but that's why we call it operational. It's putting a little bit of process in place based on really good data and a view of what you actually want to achieve. That's 250. Don't count them. I assure you. It's exactly right. It's probably not. So that's it. That's pretty much a quick view, heavily biased, that poops on product-led from the perspective of someone who's never been a product manager. So I hope it's exactly what you came here to get. What questions may I answer? So, come on.
I was beginning. What is your role?
Oh, sorry. So I am the leader of product marketing at this company, Pendo.
Perfect. So what you describe is my last 6 months building out a product org within marketing and trying to get them to understand outcomes and metrics and the customer. So what is a good way for me to communicate with product marketing where they've been used to bills of material and the next event and the next event after that?
Oh, well, I mean, if the product marketing organization is anchoring against events, then you need to talk to their bosses because they're not necessarily thinking about anything besides driving leads. The product marketing team's role is something different from leads. It's adoption of the product, and it's insight based on that adoption and another perspective that drives into the product organization to make the right decisions. It's bringing in a little bit of that market intelligence if you're not completely product operational yet. So to influence them, I'd ask them what the product organization is up to. Can you, product marketing, tell me what the product roadmap is and what your product marketing roadmap is as a result? Like the product marketing team's roadmap and its like agenda for the next couple of quarters should be at least in large part tied to what the company is doing in terms of product and feature rollout. That's job number one. You know, the product management team will help the engineering team build the right thing on time, but they can't get it off the shelf once it's on. The product marketing team's responsibility is getting it off the shelf and starting to like actually collaborate with the product organization to make them more operational, to encourage them to look at data, to even bring in data from marketing that they wouldn't necessarily have access to.
Thank you.
At Pendo, how do you split your sort of product marketing mind share between thinking about existing customers versus prospective customers?
Oh man, that's a great question.
Can you repeat the question?
So how, at Pendo, at my company, how do we split our mind share between acquiring new customers and engaging and expanding upon the experiences of our existing customers. And I think this was talked about in the last session. We have become obsessed with NRR, obsessed with it, both because we want to be a public company one day, and it's actually a pretty good indicator of how healthy your business is. So we're increasingly focusing on our existing customers. And the second reason is because we take this very, very seriously, and we've recently launched a product or feature within our platform called Feedback. So this is a little bit of an advertisement without actually mentioning Pendo, but it's this idea that, like, hey, you can continue to base your decisions within the product organization or even within product marketing on what you think will drive the cheapest acquisition of the most new users. But frankly, that's expensive, especially as you get bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you're able to do the double good of both building things for your best, most enthusiastic and neediest users, they'll both spend more money and become advocates. And you can cut down the cost of acquisition by using the product, which is pretty important. So we probably spend more of our time and energy on acquisition because, you know, as a company, one of the things that, like, I really like to focus on is, like, can we get past leads? Can we get to a point where, like, if they get to a certain level of experience with our brand, at least, that we're giving them a high level of confidence that the product can actually do what they need it to do, and, like, tying into use cases and things like that. So that's a big effort still. But the rest of it is not on really any part of acquisition. It's more on, like, nurture and expansion.
In terms of the data that product operations is dealing with, are they dealing with external data as well, market data, data about buyer needs, things like that?
Absolutely. Yes, so it's this idea of correlation between what has been done and what it actually means. So building out cohorts, not just based on the behaviors, but based on where those behaviors actually lead in terms of business outcomes. So looking at product data along with your CRM data, or your marketing operations and automation systems data, or your feature flag data. We had Sachin has an experience at LaunchDarkly. So really being able to bring those things together. And there are different ways to do it. You can pull that into a tool or a platform like Pendo, or you can put it into your data warehouse and build a better relationship between your product organization and your business operations organization. That's another way to become more operational within the product organization. Oh, there you are. Not just to have the product organization own it, but to have them work with other teams. I think this was like a big part of the upshot of the last talk. Like, build that intimacy, not only with the user and the customer, but with the rest of the company.
Okay, we'll end it there so we can get to our break. Ryan, thank you so much.
you.
That was super awesome.